We get a lot of talk about toxic masculinity, and I want to say up front that I think there are a heck of a lot of really decent young men out there who feel troubled and affronted and alienated by the idea that their masculinity is toxic. And I think they're the people who go to hear Jordan Peterson because they're struggling with that. They're saying, I don't want to be toxic, I want to be a decent human being. We'll come to the ones that are toxic in a moment.
Sure.
But I do think this is very damaging, this sort of blanket assertion that sometimes seems to imply, it seems to be out there that men are just inherently toxic and somehow we've got to develop programs to demasculinize them.
Yeah, so again, I think one of our challenges today is we're actually not giving our young men a kind of constructive model of masculinity, and so they tend to, retreat either into the basement or into, other forms of antisocial kind of hyper-masculine behavior that's not good, and it actually is toxic. But I think if we kind of gave them a more constructive model of what it means to be a man in the 21st century, we would avoid some of these problems. But to kind of follow up on your point, I think it's no doubt as well, too, that there is toxic forms of masculinity, which we do see in, say, spiking crime rates in the U.S. We do see in terms of things like domestic violence. And it's, I think, important to note it's often when men are failing to kind of be integrated into our core institutions that they act in toxic ways. So if they're failing in school, if they are not married, if they're not gainfully employed, they're often more likely to, for instance, engage in domestic violence. So we know that, for instance, rates of domestic violence are much higher among cohabiting couples than they're among married couples. They're higher for men who are unemployed than for men who are employed. So again, I think men are more likely to flourish on average when they're embedded in core institutions like marriage and work. And when they're not, they're more likely to succumb to a kind of toxic form of masculinity.
Is it in part that we don't provide opportunities for young men to exercise responsibility and expect them to step up and accept responsibility? We don't do adulting anymore?
Yeah, I think we don't do adulting enough in general. Yeah, across the board. I mean, I think, this is true for young adults, both female and male, but I think it's especially the case that we're not doing enough to kind of basically scaffold the transition into adult masculinity for our young men. Of course, across time and space, most cultures have had strong rites of passage that have taken, teenage boys basically and ushered them into adulthood, and then given them kind of like a to-do list. This is what you've got to do as an adult male. And we don't do enough of that today in our contemporary culture.
There's been, on the horrific issue of family violence or of domestic violence, there's been a bit of controversy in Australia built around some research done in America, and I'm not sure about the quality of the research all the way, and it was interpreted in Australia, genuinely uncertain, but an attempt to link, particularly in sections of the media that are hostile to Christianity, a link between conservative ideas of gender roles,
right.
And
sure.
What have you, and domestic violence. It's an area I understand you've done quite a bit of research
in my book on sort of religion and family life for American men, what I found was that men who were basically nominal evangelicals or nominal conservative Protestants were the most likely to be reporting domestic violence, whereas men who were attending church regularly as conservative Protestants or as evangelicals had the lowest reports of domestic violence. And don't know entirely what's sort of happening there, but I think one possibility is that men who are kind of exposed to sort of, Christian or religious notions of sort of patriarchy and authority in a very kind of, thin way, in a very kind of, cursory way, could take that as a sort of a license to be authoritarian or abusive.
To justify
their own bad behavior, or just their desire to lord it over, a wife or girlfriend and kids. So I think that's certainly part of the story there. But at least in the U.S. context, in the data that I was looking at, men who were engaged in religious communities where, they're encouraged to kind of be of service, where there's some kind of accountability, in their own religious community, where they're seeing other husbands kind of, making an effort to be good good fathers and good spouses seem to have, a lower risk on that front. So I think that's noteworthy. We've also seen kind of in newer research in the United States that when you're looking at kind of men and housework on the home front, we're seeing that religious men are now reporting the highest levels of domestic work, childcare, doing dishes, things like that. And I think this is kind of a reflection of this sort of new recognition that the family is, in important ways, under threat. And so as husbands and fathers, we need to kind of step up and do more to help out on the home front. But I think anyone who's been involved in a religious context knows that domestic violence is a reality. And I think we could do more, both from the pulpit and other contexts, to kind of communicate the message that A, that's not acceptable, and B, that if you're having difficulties in your marriage, there are resources out there that you can plug into to strengthen and improve your marriage as well.
I think it's fair to say that there'd be a broad view in modern society that people who take their religious faith seriously are uptight and probably less happy and less free,
right,
than those who have discarded those old superstitions.
Sure.
Your research suggests something quite different,
Yeah.
that people who take faith seriously actually record higher levels of happiness,
Right.
including women.
Right, sure.
In deeply faithful households.
Yeah, actually I was just reading another study this morning and found, this is a study of British women, that more religious British women reported more sexual desire than their less religious peers, which is kind of another sort of part of this puzzle. But to kind of answer your question, we do see that religious, in the US context, Americans are happier in their marriages and report more sexual satisfaction. And both on the sexual satisfaction side of the ledger and on the marital happiness sort of outcomes, we see that religious women who attend church with their husbands are doing the best. And I think that's in some ways surprising, because we've had kind of like this whole idea in the US of sort of like, there was this famous show called Saturday Night Live, and they had this sort of skit with the church lady, and she was a very uptight, kind of prudish, probably Southern woman. And I think one could get kind of the sort of sense from this pop cultural perspective that, religious women are, again, sort of dour and unhappy and uptight. But I think there's something about the sense of security and trust engendered in a religious marriage on average. The commitment to things like, forgiveness, that end up translating into higher quality relationships and even higher quality sexual relationships. And so what we're seeing kind of in general in the research is this sort of what happens outside of the bedroom ends up mattering for what happens inside the bedroom. And one of those things that happens outside of the bedroom in some contexts, of course, is a sort of a strong faith and a strong religious community. And couples who have the benefit of those kinds of things are more likely to be flourishing in the bedroom as well, I think, because their sense of commitment and trust and emotional security then kind of feed into a stronger sexual relationship as well. So that's, I think, for some folks, that's kind of surprising.